I never told my future son-in-law the truth about the empire I spent 40 years building. He thought he had me completely fooled. 2 weeks before my daughter's wedding, I was having dinner alone when I overheard him whisper, "After the wedding, everything will finally be ours." I froze and secretly recorded the conversation. The man everyone praised for his kindness and charity was discussing a plan with someone I had never met. I thought I was hearing a business deal until I heard my own name and realized my daughter was about to marry a stranger. If this story is already pulling at you, you're exactly where you need to be. Welcome to Revenge Dad. Before we go further, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. Your city, your country, I read every single one. Please note, this story contains fictional elements crafted for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to actual names or events is coincidental, but everything I'm about to share with you is worth hearing. I want to tell you about the night I sat alone at a restaurant in Los Angeles and listened to the man my daughter loved describe in a calm and pleasant voice exactly how he planned to destroy everything I had spent 40 years building. But to understand why that night changed everything, you first need to understand what those 40 years looked like. My name is Richard Hayes. I am 67 years old, and I am the founder and chief executive officer of Hayes Medical Group, a network of 23 private hospitals stretching from Brooklyn, New York to San Diego, California. 12,000 employees, 400 beds in our flagship Manhattan location alone. A payroll that would make most people's heads swim. But none of that is where the story starts. The story starts in 1984 in a rented storefront on Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, with a second-hand examination table, a medical license I'd earned on student loans, and a promise I made to myself on the day I graduated from Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons. The promise was simple. No one who walked through my door would be turned away because they couldn't pay. 40 years later, that promise had grown into something I never could have imagined standing in that Brooklyn storefront. Hayes Medical Group served over 2 million patients annually. We had pioneered cardiac care programs that drew physicians from across the country to study our outcomes. We had built pediatric wings in neighborhoods that hadn't seen a new medical facility in decades. I had built all of it with my wife, Margaret. She passed away 8 years ago from a form of ovarian cancer that our own oncology team fought for 14 months before it won. I was with her at the end, holding her hand in a room on the 6th floor of our Manhattan hospital, a room I had personally ensured would have the best view of Central Park. She looked out that window for a long time before she turned to me and said the last meaningful thing she ever said to me. "Take care of her, Richard. She has my heart." She meant Emily. Our daughter, Emily Hayes, was 34 years old and had absolutely no interest in running a hospital empire. She had her mother's eyes, her mother's laugh, and her mother's absolute refusal to let inherited wealth define who she was. While I had spent 4 decades building Hayes Medical Group, Emily had spent her career building something quieter, Hope Bridge Foundation, a nonprofit organization she had created from scratch at the age of 28, dedicated to providing educational support and mental health resources to children in underserved communities across the 5 boroughs of New York. She could have had a corner office with her name on the door at Hayes Medical. She chose a cramped workspace in a building in the Bronx where the elevator broke down twice a month. I had never been more proud of anyone in my life. So, when Emily called me on a Tuesday evening in late September of last year and told me she had met someone, really met someone, she said, her voice carrying a brightness I hadn't heard in years. I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized had been tight for a very long time. "His name is Alexander Reed, Dad," she said. "I met him on the Kentucky trip, the volunteer weekend I told you about." "Tell me about him," I said. And she did. For 45 minutes, she told me about a man named Alexander Reed, 39 years old, the founder and chief executive of Reed Philanthropic Ventures, a company that, according to Emily, operated a network of charitable initiatives across the American South and Midwest. He had been on the same volunteer trip she had, distributing school supplies and medical equipment to rural communities in eastern Kentucky. Emily described watching him kneel down beside a 7-year-old boy with a bandaged arm and spend 20 minutes talking to the child about baseball, making the boy laugh until his mother was wiping her own eyes. "He didn't know I was watching," Emily told me. "He wasn't performing for anyone, Dad. He was just kind, the way Mom was kind." I felt my throat tighten when she said that. My daughter did not invoke her mother lightly. I met Alexander Reed for the first time 6 weeks later at Le Bernardin in Midtown Manhattan, a restaurant I had frequented for business dinners for 2 decades. He arrived exactly on time, which I noted because I have found that punctuality is one of the few virtues that cannot be faked. He was well dressed without being showy, handsome in an unassuming way, and he shook my hand with the kind of grip that communicates confidence without trying to prove anything. Over dinner, he asked me questions about Hayes Medical Group that told me he had done his research, not surface-level research, but the kind that required genuine effort. He asked about our cardiac readmission rates. He asked about our community benefit spending as a percentage of revenue. And then he asked me something that stopped me mid-bite. "How do you keep profit from becoming the priority, Richard?" he said. "That's the question I've been trying to answer my whole career. Most people I talk to in healthcare say the right things, but the numbers tell a different story. Your numbers actually match your mission. I want to understand how you did that." I set down my fork. In 40 years of building Hayes Medical Group, no one had ever asked me that question so directly. I talked for 20 minutes straight, and Alexander Reed listened, not the polite nodding listening that people perform when they're waiting for their turn to speak, but the real kind, the kind where the other person's eyes stay completely focused, and they ask follow-up questions that prove they actually heard what you said. By the time we left the restaurant that night, I had decided that my daughter had found someone worth knowing. I want to be honest with you about something, because honesty is the only currency this story has any use for. There was one moment that evening, a single flicker gone, almost before it registered, that I have thought about every single day since. It came near the end of dinner when the conversation turned to the future. I mentioned without thinking much of it that Emily would inherit a significant stake in Hayes Medical Group when I eventually stepped back from the business. Something moved behind Alexander Reed's eyes. It was there for less than a second, a brief sharpening like a lens coming into focus before the warmth and the ease returned, and he said something gracious about hoping Emily would always have the freedom to pursue whatever made her happiest. I told myself I was imagining things. I was wrong about that. But what I didn't know then, and what I have thought about every single day since, is that Alexander Reed had not stumbled into my daughter's life on that volunteer trip to Kentucky. He had chosen that trip with deliberate care months in advance after studying Emily's schedule, her organization, and her calendar of community events. He had positioned himself in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. He hadn't found my daughter, he had hunted her. There is a particular kind of blindness that comes from wanting something to be true. I have watched it happen to patients' families for 40 years. The wife who insists her husband's test results must be wrong. The father who refuses to hear the word malignant, even after it has been said 3 times in a row. I always thought of it as a failure of courage, that unwillingness to see what is directly in front of you. I never thought I would catch it myself. In the months that followed that first dinner at Le Bernardin, Alexander Reed became a fixture in our lives with a naturalness that I found at the time deeply reassuring. He did not force himself into our routines. He was invited again and again because he made every room he entered feel warmer than it had been before he arrived. He remembered things. That was the detail that disarmed me most completely. The first time he came to our penthouse on Park Avenue for dinner, he noticed the photograph of Margaret on the bookshelf in my study. A candid shot taken at our 25th wedding anniversary, her head thrown back in laughter at something I had said. He stood in front of it for a moment, then turned to me with something genuine in his expression. "She looks like she made the whole room laugh," he said. My chest tightened so sharply I had to look away. "She did," I said. "Every single room she walked into." "Emily has that same quality," Alexander said quietly. "I noticed it the first day I met her. She doesn't try to make people comfortable. She just does it naturally. I think that's the rarest thing in the world." I poured us both a glass of bourbon after that, and we talked for 2 hours about Margaret, her work as a volunteer, reading tutor in the Bronx, her absolute refusal to let me buy her anything she considered unnecessary, the way she could silence an entire dinner table with a single raised eyebrow. Alexander asked questions that proved he was listening, not waiting. By the time Emily joined us from the kitchen, my eyes were burning in a way I had not allowed them to burn in a very long time. Over the weeks that followed, he came to dinner on Thursdays, then Sundays too. He learned that I took my coffee black with no sugar, and made sure there was always a fresh pot ready when he arrived before I did. He learned the names of my 3 senior department heads at Hayes Medical, and asked thoughtful follow-up questions about each of them the next time we spoke, as though their challenges mattered to him personally. One evening in late October, after Emily had gone to bed early with a headache, Alexander and I sat on the terrace with our drinks and watched the lights of Manhattan spread out below us. He turned to me with an expression that seemed almost hesitant, which was unusual for a man who carried himself with such natural ease. "Can I ask you something personal, Richard?" he said. "Go ahead," I said. "When did you know Hayes Medical had become something real?" he asked. "Not just financially. I mean, when did you feel it in your chest? When did you know it mattered?" I looked out at the city for a long moment, and then I told him about the winter of 1991, when a 7-year-old girl named Rosa came into our Brooklyn clinic with pneumonia so advanced that 2 other facilities had turned her family away because they had no insurance. We treated her for 3 weeks. She walked out healthy. Her mother stood in the doorway on the last day and pressed both my hands between hers and said something in Spanish that I did not fully understand, but I felt it go straight through my sternum. That was the moment, I told Alexander. Everything after that was just making sure it could keep happening. Alexander stared into his glass for a moment. When he looked up, his eyes were bright in a way that looked like genuine emotion. "That's exactly what I want to build," he said. "Something that keeps happening long after I'm gone." I believed him completely. I want to be precise about that, because precision matters in this story. I did not half believe him, or mostly believe him. I believed every word without reservation, the way you believe things, when the evidence in front of you has been carefully and expertly arranged to support exactly one conclusion. It was around this time that something happened, which I have since replayed many times, wishing I had paid closer attention. One afternoon, I was walking through the administrative corridor at Hayes Medical Manhattan when my chief medical officer, Dr. Margaret Carroll, a woman who had worked alongside me for 20 years, and whose instincts I trusted more than almost anyone alive, fell into step beside me on her way to a department meeting. "Richard," she said in that careful tone she used when she was about to mention something she wasn't sure warranted a full conversation. "I got a call this week from a company called Pacific Rim Medical Supplies. Sales representative very polished. They're pitching a line of ICU monitoring equipment and ventilator components at prices about 30% below our current contracts." I kept walking. "What did you tell them?" "I told them to send the catalog and I'd pass it along to procurement," she said. "I just wanted you to know it was on my desk. The pricing seemed unusual." "Everything seems unusual until it isn't," I said, which is the kind of thing a man says when his mind is somewhere else entirely. "Let procurement take a look." Dr. Carroll nodded and turned toward her meeting. I kept walking, already thinking about something else. I have thought about that conversation many times since. About the word she used, unusual. About the way she said it, careful, precise, the tone of a physician who has spent 30 years trusting the small voice that says something does not quite add up. I walked right past that voice without breaking stride. That same evening, Alexander came to dinner. Afterward, while Emily was in the kitchen, he leaned back in his chair with the comfortable ease of a man who felt genuinely at home, and the conversation drifted to the future. I mentioned, without any particular thought behind it, that I had been seriously considering stepping back from day-to-day operations within the next 3 years, handing off to a permanent successor, spending more time in the places Margaret and I had always planned to visit together and never did. I did not notice it the first time. I only understood it later on, my third time listening to a recording I had not yet made, when I heard Alexander's voice describe details from that exact conversation as part of a plan he had been building for months. But that night, I simply noticed the flicker again, that half-second sharpening behind his eyes there, and gone before I could name it, and I told myself for the second time that I was imagining things. 2 weeks before my daughter's wedding, I flew to Los Angeles for what I believed was the most routine business trip of the year. I was wrong about that in every possible way. I have eaten alone in a lot of restaurants over 40 years of business travel. Airport steakhouses in cities I could not have found on a map without help. Hotel dining rooms where the bread arrives cold and the service moves at the pace of a man who has stopped caring. I have eaten alone at tables for 2 in some of the finest restaurants in the country with nothing but a briefing document and a glass of wine for company, and I have never once found it anything other than efficient. I have never been grateful for it until the evening I sat down at Nobu in West Hollywood and happened to choose the table near the outdoor partition. The meeting with the Hayes Medical West Coast leadership team had run 6 hours and 20 minutes longer than scheduled, because our director of operations in San Diego had brought 3 months of deferred maintenance reports that required immediate attention. By the time we finished, it was past 8 in the evening, and I had eaten nothing since a granola bar on the plane. My driver dropped me at the restaurant on North La Cienega Boulevard, and I walked in feeling the particular exhaustion that comes not from physical effort, but from 6 hours of making decisions that other people's livelihoods depend on. The hostess offered me a table inside near the bar. I asked instead for the semi-outdoor section along the side of the building, a partially covered terrace area, separated from the main dining room by a partition of tall, potted bamboo plants, the kind of arrangement that feels private without actually being so. I chose it because I wanted air, because the inside of the restaurant was loud with the particular sound of Los Angeles money celebrating itself, and I wanted to hear myself think. I ordered a whiskey and the black cod, and I opened the briefing document for the following morning's call with our insurance carrier. I did not look up for the first 15 minutes. When I did, it was because something at the far end of the terrace caught my peripheral vision, a familiar gesture, a particular way of leaning forward across a table that I recognized without immediately understanding why. I looked up fully, and my entire body went still. Alexander Reed was sitting 12 feet away from me. He was at a corner table at the far end of the terrace, positioned with his back at an angle to the rest of the seating area, facing a woman I had never seen before. She was somewhere in her mid-30s, dressed in a charcoal blazer over a silk blouse, with this kind of precise, understated appearance that speaks of serious money, managed quietly. Between them on the table were 2 glasses of wine, a leather portfolio, and what appeared to be a printed spreadsheet, folded lengthwise. My first thought was that this was a business dinner. Alexander traveled frequently for his philanthropic work. He had mentioned meetings in Los Angeles before. I began to reach for my phone to send him a quick text, something light letting him know I was in the same restaurant and not wanting to interrupt. I never sent that text, because as I reached for my phone, Alexander leaned closer across the table and said something to the woman in a voice that carried clearly through the bamboo partition in the way that voices carry in outdoor spaces when the speaker believes they cannot be overheard. Once the wedding goes through, he said, the whole Hayes infrastructure opens up. 23 hospitals. That's the number, Jessica. 23. The whiskey glass was halfway to my mouth. I set it down on the table without making a sound, and something happened in my body that I can only describe as a complete cessation. My breathing slowed, my hand steadied, and the part of my brain that had spent 40 years reading financial statements and identifying the single number that does not belong suddenly took over everything else. I did not move. I did not call out. I pressed myself back into my chair, angled slightly behind the edge of the bamboo partition, and I reached into my jacket pocket for my phone. My fingers did not shake. I want to be clear about that, because people sometimes assume that a moment like this must feel chaotic. It did not. It felt like the opposite of chaos. It felt like the absolute terrible clarity of a diagnosis you already know is coming. I opened the voice recorder application and pressed the red button. The woman, Jessica, he had called her, leaned forward over the spreadsheet. "And the timeline still holds," she said. Her voice was precise and unhurried, the voice of someone accustomed to discussing large numbers without emotional attachment to any of them. "And the timeline holds," Alexander said. "Richard is exactly where we need him. He trusts me completely. Emily trusts me completely. By the time either of them understands what the documents they have signed actually mean, the transfers will already have cleared." My chest did not tighten. My jaw did not clench. I sat completely still, and I listened, and I recorded every word. Alexander continued in that same calm, businesslike tone, the tone I now understood that I had never actually heard from him before, because the voice he had used with me for 8 months was a construction as carefully built as everything else about him. He described the plan to introduce Pacific Rim Medical Supplies into Hayes Medical's procurement pipeline after the wedding, framing it as a cost reduction initiative he would champion from his position as a trusted family member on the advisory board. The equipment, he explained to Jessica, was sourced from manufacturers in Southeast Asia who operated outside standard regulatory frameworks. The documentation had been prepared to pass initial inspection. The markup between their acquisition cost and the price Hayes Medical would pay was, in his words, substantial. "And if procurement flags it," Jessica asked, "Richard will override it," Alexander said with a certainty that told me he had studied not just our financials, but our organizational culture. He trusts the people he trusts, and right now, he trusts me more than anyone in that building. I breathed slowly through my nose and kept the phone steady. Then Jessica asked the question that I have heard in my mind every single day since that evening. She looked across the spreadsheet at the man my daughter was going to marry in 14 days, and she said, "And Emily, does she know anything?" Alexander picked up his wine glass. He smiled, and even from 12 feet away, even through a partition of bamboo plants, I could see that the smile did not reach his eyes. "Emily," he said, "sees exactly what I want her to see." I pressed stop on the recorder. I sat at that table for another 90 seconds, breathing carefully, letting the sound of the restaurant wash back over me, the clink of glasses, the murmur of other conversations, the distant noise of Sunset Boulevard. Then I placed my napkin on the table, picked up my jacket, and walked out of Nobu through the interior of the restaurant, taking the long way around so that I would not pass the terrace. I stood on the sidewalk outside on North La Cienega Boulevard in the warm Los Angeles evening, and for exactly 30 seconds, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what I had just heard. Then I put it away, because falling apart was not something I had the luxury of doing yet. I had work to do. The taxi driver was a young man named Marcus. I remember his name because it was printed on the license displayed on the dashboard, and I found myself reading it 3 times during the ride back to the Ritz-Carlton because my brain needed something small and concrete to hold on to while the rest of it processed what had just happened. Marcus asked me if I had a good evening. I told him it had been fine. My voice came out exactly as it always does, level unhurried, the voice of a man with nothing particular on his mind. 40 years of delivering difficult news to patients and their families had given me a face that does not betray what is happening behind it. And that night, sitting in the back of a black sedan, moving through the lights of West Hollywood, I was grateful for that training in a way I had never expected to be. Inside, something that felt very much like the ground was no longer there. I did not listen to the recording in the taxi. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, and I watched the city move past the window. The palm trees lit from below, the restaurant still full. At this hour, the particular brightness of Los Angeles at night that always struck me as slightly defiant, as though the city had decided long ago that darkness was optional. I watched all of it, and I felt absolutely nothing, which I understood was not the absence of feeling, but the presence of too much of it for my body to process all at once. Back in my room on the 14th floor of the Ritz-Carlton, I sat on the edge of the bed and I took out my phone. I listened to the recording for the first time, with my eyes closed, my elbows on my knees, my face in my free hand. I heard Alexander's voice, that calm, businesslike voice I had never heard from him before, lay out the structure of a plan that had been running parallel to everything I thought I knew about the past 8 months. I heard Jessica Miller ask her precise, unhurried questions. I heard the words, "Transfers will already have cleared," and "substantial markup," and "Richard will override it," and each one landed somewhere behind my sternum with a weight I could feel physically, like pressure building in a room with no windows. When it ended, I sat without moving for a long moment. Then I pressed play again. The second time, I listened differently, the way I read financial statements when something has already caught my attention, slowly tracking backward from the anomaly to find the pattern it belongs to. I heard things I had missed the first time. The comfort in Alexander's voice when he said, "Richard trusts me completely," not the satisfaction of someone who has earned trust, but the satisfaction of someone who has manufactured it. The ease with which he described Emily's position in all of this, as though she were a variable in an equation rather than a person he had looked in the eye every day for 8 months and told that he loved her. My daughter's face came to me, then her mother's eyes, her mother's laugh, and something cracked open in my chest that I had to breathe through, carefully pressing one hand flat against my sternum until it passed. I pressed play a third time, and on the third listen, I heard something that I had not caught before, something that turned the temperature of the room down by several degrees in the space of a single sentence. Alexander was describing the financial timeline to Jessica, and he said, with the confidence of a man reciting something he had verified many times, "The retirement window is 3 years, which he told me himself over dinner. And the board restructuring he mentioned last month gives us the opening we need on the governance side." I lifted my head. The retirement conversation. I remembered it precisely: the terrace, the bourbon, the lights of Manhattan spread below us. I had offered that information freely in the way you share things with someone you have decided to trust. I had thought it was a conversation between 2 men building a relationship. It was a debrief. Every dinner, every question about Hayes Medical's mission and structure and culture, every thoughtful follow-up about my department heads. Alexander Reed had not been building a relationship with me. He had been conducting research. He had been sitting across from me with a recorder running behind his eyes, cataloging everything I said, filing it away into a plan that had been in motion long before I ever shook his hand at Le Bernardin. I set the phone down on the bed. My hands, which had been steady all evening, were trembling now, a fine, controlled tremor that I recognized as the body's delayed response to something the mind has been holding at bay. I pressed my palms flat against my thighs and breathed slowly in through the nose and out through the mouth, the way I used to teach medical students to breathe when they were standing in a room where something had gone very wrong and they needed to stay functional. I opened my wallet. Inside, behind my driver's license and my Hayes Medical Group ID, I kept a photograph that I had carried for 8 years. Margaret on the porch of the house in Connecticut, where we spent our summers squinting slightly into the afternoon sun, one hand raised to shield her eyes, laughing at something off camera. I did not remember who had taken the picture or what had made her laugh. I only knew that every time I looked at it, I could hear her voice. "You always see people as they want to be seen," she had told me once, not unkindly. "It's your greatest quality and your greatest vulnerability. You believe in people's best versions of themselves." I looked at her face for a long time. Then I closed my wallet, picked up my phone, and opened my contacts. I scrolled to the name I had been moving towards since the moment I walked out of that restaurant and stood on the sidewalk telling myself I had work to do. Patricia Collins, senior partner. 15 years of working alongside me through every significant legal and financial challenge Hayes Medical Group had ever faced. She answered on the second ring, which told me she was still at her desk in New York even at this hour. "Richard," she said, "it's late." "I know," I said. "Patricia, I need you, tonight." There was a pause. Not the pause of someone who needs to think about whether to help, but the pause of someone who was already reaching for a notepad. "Tell me," she said, and I did. "Patricia Collins has worked with me for 15 years. In that time, she has handled a hostile takeover attempt from a private equity firm that wanted to strip Hayes Medical's non-profit divisions for parts. She has navigated a federal audit that lasted 11 months and cost us $400,000 in legal fees before concluding that we had done nothing wrong. She sat across from me in this same conference room 3 years ago when one of our senior surgeons was accused of malpractice in a case that could have cost us everything, and she did not change her expression once during the entire 3-hour briefing. She used the words federal territory within 10 minutes of hearing the recording. "Play it again," she said when it finished the first time. I played it again. She listened with her pen held loosely between 2 fingers, not writing anything, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere above my left shoulder. When it ended the second time, she set the pen down on the legal pad in front of her and looked at me directly. "Richard," she said, "what you're describing, the pattern of financial inducement, the fraudulent documentation, the interstate elements, this isn't a civil matter. This is federal territory. And if what's on that recording is accurate, it has been federal territory for longer than 2 weeks. "How do we find out how long?" I asked. "We bring in someone who knows how to look," she said. She reached for her phone. "I'm going to call Ray Donovan." Ray Donovan had spent 20 years as a special agent with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit before leaving to build his own private investigative practice in Los Angeles. Patricia had worked with him on 2 previous cases and described him in the understated way. She described everything as the most thorough person she had ever seen in a room with a spreadsheet. He arrived at Patricia's Midtown Manhattan office the following morning, having taken the red-eye from Los Angeles at Patricia's request, carrying a leather messenger bag and the particular alertness of someone who functions better at 6 in the morning than most people do at noon. He shook my hand, sat down across the conference table, listened to the recording once without interrupting, and then said, "Give me 48 hours. He was back in 52. I was standing at the window of my office on the 40th floor of Hayes Medical Group's Manhattan headquarters when Patricia called to tell me Ray was ready to present his findings. I remember the exact quality of the light that afternoon, flat and gray, the kind of May afternoon in New York that can't decide whether to be spring or not. I took the elevator down to Patricia's office, and when I walked into the conference room, Ray was already there, his laptop open, 3 printed documents arranged in a neat row on the table in front of him. "Sit down, Richard," Patricia said. Her voice had the careful, measured quality it gets when she is about to say something she wishes she did not have to say. I sat down. My hands were steady. My chest felt hollow. Alexander Reed. Ray began in the flat, factual tone of a man who has delivered difficult information many times and has learned that decoration does not help is not his legal name. His legal name is Andrew Reeves. He was born in Springfield, Illinois, 41 years ago. He has used the name Alexander Reed for approximately 6 years, supported by documentation that our preliminary analysis suggests was fraudulently obtained. The room felt very still. "Go on," I said. Prior to adopting the Reed identity, Andrew Reeves was engaged to a woman named Caroline Walsh in Chicago, Illinois. Ray slid the first printed document across the table toward me, a property record from Cook County. Mrs. Walsh is 61 years old. She is the majority owner of a regional hotel group that her late husband built over 30 years. 6 months into their engagement, she transferred 40% of her ownership stake in the company into a joint trust that named Andrew Reeves as co-trustee. I looked at the document. The numbers were clear. The signature was clear. 8 weeks after that transfer was completed, Ray continued. Andrew Reeves ended the engagement and disappeared from Mrs. Walsh's life entirely. She did not file a police report. She did not pursue civil litigation. Based on what I can find in public records, she has not spoken publicly about the relationship in any forum. "Because she was ashamed," I said. My voice came out flat. "That's my assessment," Ray said. He slid the second document across the table. The second case is Sandra Morrison, Dallas, Texas. 55 years old, widowed, significant real estate holdings inherited from her husband's estate. Same pattern engagement within 4 months of meeting, financial documents signed. Within 6 months, $2.3 million transferred out of her personal accounts into a joint investment vehicle that named Andrew Reeves as co-manager. He disappeared within 3 weeks of the transfer completing. My jaw tightened so sharply I felt it in my back teeth. $2.3 million? A woman in Dallas who had lost her husband and then lost her savings to a man who had studied her the way a predator studies terrain before moving through it. She filed no report either, I asked. "Nothing?" Ray said. "In my experience," he paused, choosing his words with the care of someone who has learned that precision matters more than speed. "In my experience, people who have been deceived in this way rarely seek public accountability. The humiliation of having trusted someone completely and having that trust weaponized against them is often more than they're willing to expose themselves to. They sign whatever needs to be signed, they absorb the loss, and they tell themselves it was a lesson rather than a crime." Patricia leaned forward. "Richard, I need to explain what this means legally because it changes the entire picture." She folded her hands on the table. "What Ray has found establishes what federal law calls a pattern of racketeering activity, a repeated series of fraudulent acts conducted across state lines as part of an ongoing criminal enterprise. Under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, what most people know as RICO, a pattern requires at least 2 such acts within a 10-year period. We have 2 confirmed cases, and we have your recording of a 3rd attempt in active progress." "What does that mean in practice?" I asked. "It means this is no longer a matter of protecting your assets or canceling a wedding," Patricia said, and her voice was very quiet and very clear. "It means that Andrew Reeves Alexander Reed has potentially committed federal crimes in 2 states and is actively in the process of committing a 3rd. And it means that if we handle this correctly, the women in Chicago and Dallas may finally have the opportunity for accountability that they never sought for themselves." The room held that thought for a moment. My throat felt tight in a way that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the image of Caroline Walsh signing away 40% of her life's work to a man who had spent months making her believe she was loved. "Ray," I said, "you mentioned you needed 48 hours. What are you going to do with the next 48? Ray looked at me across the table, and for the first time since he had sat down, something moved behind his eyes that was not quite professional detachment. "There's a woman connected to Reed that I haven't finished looking at yet," he said. "Her name is Jessica Miller, and what I've found so far tells me she isn't a peripheral player in this." He closed his laptop. "She has history, Richard, significant history, and I think when we understand her role fully, we're going to understand that what you heard at that restaurant in Los Angeles was not 2 people making plans. It was 2 people running a business. Ray Donovan told me, once in a later conversation, when we had more time and less urgency, that the most dangerous financial criminals are never the ones who hide. Hiding draws attention. Hiding suggests guilt. The ones who last the longest are the ones who build something that looks so thoroughly legitimate that no one thinks to examine what is underneath it. Jessica Miller had been building for a long time. Ray flew back to Los Angeles the morning after our call and spent 2 days working sources he had cultivated during his years at the Bureau, former colleagues still inside the system, a contact at the California Department of Financial Protection, a researcher at a firm that specialized in corporate due diligence for institutional investors. He called me on the evening of the second day, and I sat in my study with the door closed and my reading glasses off because I have found that I concentrate better without them when I am listening to something I need to understand completely. Jessica Miller, Ray said, 36 years old, graduated top of her class from Wharton, spent 7 years at a mid-size investment bank in New York before relocating to Los Angeles 4 years ago. On paper, she runs an advisory firm called Miller Capital Advisory, with offices in a building on Wilshire Boulevard in Beverly Hills. Professional-looking website, a business address, a phone number that gets answered. And in reality, I said. In reality, Ray said, Miller Capital Advisory has no verifiable clients, no regulatory filings consistent with an active advisory practice, and no record of completed transactions. It exists on paper and on a website and nowhere else. What it does have is a set of bank accounts, domestic accounts, connected to 2 offshore entities registered in the Cayman Islands and 1 in Luxembourg. I leaned forward in my chair. She's moving money, moving it, layering it, making it difficult to trace back to its origin, Ray said. That's money laundering, Richard, the process of taking funds generated through illegal activity and running them through enough legitimate-looking transactions that the source becomes obscured. Under federal law, that's 18 United States Code. Section 1956. It carries a maximum of 20 years. What's her connection to Reed to Reeves? They've been operating together for at least 4 years, Ray said. She handles the financial architecture. He handles the human element. She builds the structures that receive the money. He goes out and finds it. He paused. She was also investigated by the Securities and Exchange Commission in 2019 for her role in a pump and dump scheme involving a small pharmaceutical company. The investigation was closed due to insufficient evidence. Looking at what I'm seeing now, I think they just weren't looking in the right places. I stood up from my chair and walked to the window because sitting still had become impossible. Outside of Park Avenue was quiet in the way it gets late on a weeknight. The traffic thinned to occasional headlights moving uptown. Ray, I said. Pacific Rim Medical Supplies. I was getting there, he said. I drove up to San Francisco yesterday. Their offices are in a building in the Soma district south of Market, the tech and light industrial area. The office looks completely ordinary from the outside. Reception desk product catalogs on the table, a woman who answers the phone and schedules appointments. And the products... Ray's voice shifted slightly, a small change in register that I had come to recognize as the sound of a careful man about to say something he wishes were not true. I have a contact at the Food and Drug Administration's Medical Device Division, he said. The FDA is the federal agency responsible for certifying that medical equipment sold in the United States meets safety and performance standards. Clearance means the agency has verified the device does what it claims to do at the level it claims to do it. Pacific Rim Medical Supplies has submitted 47 clearance applications in the past 2 years. How many are legitimate? I said, though some part of me already knew the answer. 3, Ray said. The remaining 44 applications contain falsified test data, fabricated laboratory certifications, and in several cases, manufacturer documentation from facilities that either do not exist or are not registered with any regulatory authority. My hand tightened on the phone until I could feel my pulse in my fingers. 44 falsified applications. 44 pieces of equipment being sold to medical facilities across the country, with documentation designed to make them appear safe-tested and approved when they were none of those things. What kind of equipment? I said. ICU patient monitoring systems, Ray said. Ventilator components, infusion pump regulators. He read from his notes in a flat, even tone that I understood was the professional discipline of a man who had learned to deliver terrible information without letting his own reaction contaminate it. The monitoring systems show accuracy rates of 61% under independent testing. The required minimum for patient safety certification is 99%. The ventilator pressure valves have a documented failure rate of 23% under sustained use. I pressed my free hand flat against the window glass. 61% accuracy on a heart monitor in an intensive care unit meant that nearly 4 out of every 10 readings could be wrong. A wrong reading in an ICU did not mean an inconvenience. It meant a doctor making a decision based on false information in a room where the margin for error was measured in minutes. "Has this equipment already been sold?" I said. "To 2 small regional medical centers in New Jersey," Ray said. "I flagged it to my FDA contact this morning. They are looking into it urgently." He stopped. "Richard, I need you to hear the next part clearly." "Go ahead," I said. 6 weeks ago, a patient in the intensive care unit of one of those New Jersey facilities did not survive the night. The official cause was listed as equipment malfunction. The incident has not yet been formally investigated. He paused. "I'm not telling you this to cause you additional distress. I'm telling you because you need to understand the full scope of what we are dealing with. This is no longer only about your family or your organization. This has consequences that have already reached people we don't know." I stood at that window for a long time after Ray finished speaking. The city below me kept moving taxis' headlights, a couple, walking a dog along the avenue, all of it proceeding with the complete indifference of a world that did not know what I now knew. I thought about a patient in New Jersey whose name I did not know, in a room I had never seen in a building that had nothing to do with me, and I felt the full weight of how wrong that last part was. It had everything to do with me, because the man who had engineered this was 14 days away from becoming a member of my family and gaining access to 23 hospitals full of people who trusted that the equipment keeping them alive had been tested and verified and approved. I was still standing at the window when my phone buzzed with a call from Patricia. I answered, and before I could speak, she said, "Sandra Weiss just called me. She's a special agent with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit here in New York. She said they've been building a case against Alexander Reed Andrew Reeves for the past 8 months under a separate investigation." I turned away from the window. 8 months, I said. "And they didn't move?" They couldn't," Patricia said. "To take a case like this to a federal grand jury, the panel of citizens who decide whether there's enough evidence to formally charge someone, you need direct evidence of the current scheme, not just the pattern. Without that, a good defense attorney dismantles the case before it starts." "Richard," she paused. "The recording you made at Nobu, Ray's financial documentation, the falsified FDA filings, that is the direct evidence they needed. Sandra Weiss said, and I am quoting her exactly, you just gave us the missing piece." I sat down heavily in my desk chair. For 8 months, federal investigators had been watching Andrew Reeves move through his constructed life building towards something they could see the shape of, but could not yet prove. And then, a 67-year-old hospital administrator had forgotten to eat dinner before a business meeting, chosen a table near an outdoor partition, and handed them everything they needed in a 30-minute voice recording. "What does Weiss want to do?" I said. "She wants to meet," Patricia said. "She has a proposal, but Richard, she needs the wedding to happen." I looked across my desk at the photograph of Emily that I kept in a silver frame next to my computer, the one taken at her Hope Bridge Foundation's annual gala 2 years ago. Her head thrown back exactly the way her mother's had been in the Connecticut photograph, laughing at something completely genuine. "Then we let it happen," I said. "We just make sure we're ready when it does." In 40 years of medicine, I have delivered the worst news a human being can receive. I have sat across from fathers and told them their children were not coming home. I have held the hands of women who would be widows before the morning was over. I have learned to find the words that are honest without being cruel, and to stay present in the room after I say them. Nothing, not one conversation in 40 years, prepared me for walking into my own living room and doing it to my daughter. Emily was in the kitchen when I got home, standing at the counter with a mug of chamomile tea, her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, a folder of Hope Bridge budget reports spread open in front of her. She looked up when I came in, and her face did exactly what her mother's face used to do. Opened completely, no guardedness, no performance, just genuine warmth at the sight of someone she loved. "Dad." She pulled her glasses down and frowned slightly. "You look terrible. Did the LA meetings run long again?" "Come sit with me," I said, "in the study." Something in my voice reached her before any words did. The color shifted slightly in her face, and she set down her mug with the careful deliberateness of someone who has just understood that they need both hands free. She followed me into the study. I closed the door. I placed my phone on the desk between us, and I looked at my daughter. Her mother's eyes, her mother's way of tilting her head slightly when she was trying to read a situation. And I pressed play. Emily's reaction did not come all at once. It arrived in layers the way serious things always do. First, her brow furrowed the expression of someone trying to place a voice that sounds almost familiar. Then her lips parted. Then the color drained from her face so completely and so quickly that I reached across the desk and took hold of her hand because I was genuinely afraid she might fall. The mug she had carried in from the kitchen was still in her other hand. It slipped. I caught it before it hit the desk, but the tea splashed across the budget reports she had been working on, spreading in a slow, dark stain across 6 months of numbers she had built from nothing. She did not notice. She was staring at the phone, her chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid movements, her hand gripping mine so hard I could feel the bones of my own fingers pressing together. When Alexander's recorded voice said in that flat, businesslike tone I had never heard from him in 8 months, "Emily sees exactly what I want her to see." A sound came out of my daughter that I had not heard since the night her mother died. Not a sob, something quieter and worse than a sob, something that came from a place below where words live. "And Emily," I said. She shook her head. Her free hand came up and pressed against her mouth hard as though she were physically holding something in. Her shoulders curved inward and she bent forward over the desk, and I came around to her side and put my arms around her the way I had not done since she was small enough to carry, and she pressed her face against my shoulder, and the sound that had been trapped behind her hand finally came out ragged. Broken, the sound of someone whose understanding of the last 8 months of their life has just been taken apart and reassembled into something unrecognizable. I held her, and I did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that was equal to what she was feeling, and I have learned over a lifetime that the impulse to fill grief with words is about the speaker's discomfort, not the listener's need. After a long time, she pulled back. Her eyes were swollen and red, her face blotched, her reading glasses askew. She looked nothing like the composed, capable woman who ran a nonprofit organization with 12 full-time staff and a $4 million annual budget. She looked like my daughter. She looked 22 years old and lost. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, drew a breath that shook all the way down. Then she said something that stopped my heart completely. "Dad," her voice was barely above a whisper, raw and cracked at the edges. "3 weeks ago, Alex asked me to photograph the internal documents, the board structure, the acquisition pipeline, the asset breakdown by facility." She looked at me with eyes that had gone very still. "He said he wanted to understand your work better, so he could support you after we were married." A tear ran down her face, and she did not wipe it away. "I did it, Dad. I took every photograph he asked for. I sent them all." The room contracted around me. She grabbed both my hands, her fingers shaking against mine, her voice breaking apart on every word. I handed him everything. I handed him the whole map. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." "Emily." I held her hands tight. My own throat had closed to the width of a straw. "Listen to me. You trusted someone who had spent months earning that trust. That is not a failure. That is what he counted on." I looked at her directly, the way I had looked at patients when I needed them to hear me through their fear. What happens next is not going to be about what he took from us. It is going to be about what we do with what we know. She looked at me for a long moment, her chest still heaving, tears still running. Then something changed in her expression. The grief did not disappear, but something harder and quieter moved in underneath it. She wiped her face, sat up straight. "Tell me the plan," she said. There is a moment in every crisis, I have seen it in operating rooms and boardrooms and emergency family meetings and hospital corridors at 2 in the morning, when the shock passes and the people left standing have to decide what kind of fight they are willing to have. Not whether to fight. That question answers itself when the alternative is walking away and letting it happen to someone else. The question is always what kind, how far, how patient, how willing you are to do the harder thing, when the easier thing is standing right in front of you. That moment came in Patricia's conference room on the morning of May 24th, with 4 people around a table and a federal agent on a screen. Patricia had arranged a video call with FBI Special Agent Sandra Weiss from the New York Field Office's Financial Crimes Unit. Weiss was somewhere in her mid-40s with close-cropped dark hair and the kind of face that gave nothing away. Not coldness, not warmth, simply the particular blankness of someone who has learned over a long career that keeping their expression neutral is a professional tool, not a personal failing. She had the kind of stillness that told you she had sat in difficult rooms for a very long time without flinching, and that she was fully prepared to sit in this one for as long as it took. Emily sat beside me at the conference table, her back straight, her hands folded in front of her. She had cried everything out the night before. In my study on Park Avenue had pressed her face against my shoulder and broken apart in a way I had not heard from her since the night her mother died. Grief that complete, that deep, that final. By this morning, none of that was visible. What remained was something quieter and considerably more dangerous than grief. She had her mother's spine. I had always known that. This morning confirmed it. Patricia opened without preamble. We have 3 options. First, call off the wedding immediately and report to law enforcement now. Second, wait, gather more evidence and act when we have more. Third, allow the wedding to proceed as planned and act at the ceremony itself. Why not the first option? Emily said. Her voice was completely steady. I watched Sandra Weiss register that steadiness and recalibrate her assessment of the woman sitting across from me. We have the recording. We have Ray's documentation. Why isn't that enough to move right now? Sandra Weiss answered without hesitating. Ms. Hayes, what we have right now is strong. What we need is airtight. When we take this to a federal grand jury, the panel of citizens who decide whether there's enough evidence to formally charge someone, Reed's defense attorneys, will challenge every single piece of evidence we present. They will look for procedural errors, chain of custody issues, admissibility questions. If they successfully argue even one significant flaw, he walks, not to prison, back out into the world. She paused, letting that land. He has done this before. He will simply relocate, rebuild his identity, and find another family. Caroline Walsh and Sandra Morrison never got justice because no one built a case strong enough to survive a courtroom. I am not willing to let that happen a third time. Emily's jaw tightened. She nodded once, a single decisive motion. Ray seated to Patricia's left with his laptop open and his notes organized in the careful way of a man who spent 20 years building cases that had to hold up under cross-examination, spoke next. Option 2 is off the table. We don't have enough time to wait. Reed's financial deadline is 45 days from the wedding date. If the wedding doesn't happen, he knows something has gone wrong. He has 3 passports that we know of. He will run. Option 3. Patricia said, gives us everything we need. It allows Ray to complete the financial documentation over the next 8 days. It gives Agent Weiss's team time to coordinate with the FDA's enforcement division regarding Pacific Rim. And it places Reed in a public setting in front of 200 witnesses with no avenue of retreat and no time to prepare a response. She looked at the screen. Sandra, there is one more thing, Sandra Weiss said, and something in her tone shifted slightly, careful, precise, in a way that made everyone at the table go still without quite knowing why. We have credible intelligence suggesting that at least one of Reed's creditors operates outside normal financial channels. I cannot share details, but the implication is that the pressure on him is not only legal, he has a hard deadline. That makes him unpredictable in ways that a man operating purely rationally would not be. She looked directly at Emily through the screen. Which means, Ms. Hayes, that for the next 8 days, absolutely nothing can change. Not your tone with him, not your schedule, not the way you look at him across a dinner table, not even the way you answer his texts. The room held very still. Emily uncurled her hands from the table. She sat forward, and I saw in that forward lean the same motion I had watched her make as a child, whenever she had decided something fully and was about to say it out loud. He has been performing for me for 8 months, she said. Her voice was quiet and certain. I think I can manage 8 days. Something moved across Sandra Weiss's face, not quite a smile, but the closest thing to one I suspected she allowed herself in professional settings. I'll take that as a yes. The meeting ran another 40 minutes, logistics, evidence handling, coordination, protocols, the specific choreography of what would happen inside the Plaza Ballroom on the morning of June 1st. When it ended, Ray stayed behind to review financial documents with Patricia. Emily and I took the elevator down to the lobby together. She stopped walking when we reached the marble floor of the entrance hall. She turned to face me, and for just a moment I saw the 22-year-old beneath the composure eyes, still faintly swollen at the edges. From the night before, jaw set with the particular effort of someone carrying something very heavy and refusing to let it show in how they walk. "Hey, Dad," she said, "when this is over, when it's really over, I need you to tell me how you stayed that calm at the restaurant, standing there behind that partition just recording it, not saying anything, not walking over and—" She stopped herself. I thought about it for a moment. The bamboo partition, the whiskey glass set down without a sound, the 37-year instinct that had simply taken over before the decision was conscious. "The 40 years," I said. "You learn that the first thing you feel is almost never the most useful thing you can do." She held my gaze for a long moment. Then her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket. She glanced at the screen and I watched something extraordinary happen to her face. Watched the weight and the fury and the exhaustion of the past 72 hours disappear, completely replaced in the space of 2 seconds by an expression of warm, easy affection, so complete and so convincing that it stopped my breath entirely. She was her mother's daughter in every possible way. She looked up at me and said very quietly, "It's Alex. He wants to have dinner tonight." She pressed the phone to her ear. Her voice when she answered was bright and completely steady, carrying the exact warmth he had come to expect and count on. "Hey you, I was just thinking about you." I stood in the lobby of Patricia's building on Madison Avenue and watched my daughter perform the most difficult role she had ever been asked to play and do it without flinching, without hesitation, without a single tremor in her voice. 8 days. We could do 8 days. We are now halfway through this story, and what comes next is where everything either holds together or falls apart completely. Before I continue, type "stay" in the comments so I know you're still with me. Every single comment means the world on this channel. Heads up, this story contains some fictional elements built for entertainment and education. Parts of it may not reflect events exactly as they occurred. If that's not for you, no hard feelings. You can step away here. Dr. Margaret Carroll found me in the hallway outside my office on the morning of May 26th, moving at the particular pace she reserves for situations that cannot wait for a scheduled meeting. "Richard?" She fell into step beside me, her voice low. "I need 5 minutes." We stepped into my office and I closed the door. She placed a printed catalog on my desk, Pacific Rim Medical Supplies, the cover clean and professional, and pressed one finger against a column of pricing figures. "I pulled this after procurement flagged it as a potential contract opportunity," she said. "It came in months ago, but only reached my desk this week. It had been sitting in the standard vendor review queue. The ICU monitoring units are listed at 62% of what our current supplier charges. The ventilator components are even lower." She looked up at me, and 30 years of clinical instinct were sitting right behind her eyes. "Richard, equipment doesn't run at those prices unless something is wrong with it. I've seen this before, cheap devices from unverified manufacturers with documentation that looks right until someone actually tests the hardware." Her jaw tightened. "I want to know if this company has approached anyone else in the system." I looked at her for a moment, then I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she sat down in the chair across from my desk, something Margaret Carroll almost never did, because she was constitutionally incapable of sitting still during working hours, and she pressed both hands flat against her knees. "How long has this been in motion?" she said quietly. 8 months, I said. Something moved across her face that I recognized as the clinical equivalent of fury, controlled cold and extremely focused. She stood up. "Tell me what you need from me." "Right now," I said, "I need you to make sure nothing from Pacific Rim enters any of our facilities. No contracts, no samples, no preliminary agreements, nothing." "Done," she said. She picked up the catalog from my desk, folded it once and tucked it under her arm. At the door, she stopped and turned back. "Richard, you're going to stop this." It was not a question. I answered it anyway. "Yes," I said. "We are." That evening, Sophie Bennett arrived at Emily's apartment on West 79th Street, 40 minutes before Alexander was due to pick her up. Sophie had been Emily's closest friend since their first year at Columbia, a corporate attorney with a sharp mind, and the kind of loyalty that does not require explanation. Emily had told her everything 2 days earlier, and Sophie had responded the way she responded to every crisis in Emily's life, which was to show up in person with food and an unwillingness to leave until she was certain her friend was standing on solid ground. When I arrived to check on Emily before the dinner, Sophie opened the door and looked at me with an expression that mixed admiration with barely contained outrage on Emily's behalf. "She's getting ready," Sophie said. She's been in that bathroom for 20 minutes, and I can hear her coaching herself in the mirror. I found Emily in the hallway in a green dress, her hair done, her face composed into something that bore almost no resemblance to the woman who had wept in my study 3 nights ago. She looked at me, and the composure cracked slightly at the edges. Not enough for anyone else to see, but enough for a father who had been reading that face for 34 years. "You don't have to do this," I said quietly. "Yes, I do," she said. Her chin lifted fractionally, her mother's gesture down to the millimeter. "Caroline Walsh did it alone, Dad. Sandra Morrison did it alone. I have an entire team behind me and the truth on my side." She straightened the strap of her small handbag. "I can manage one dinner." She told me everything afterwards, sitting at my kitchen table at 11 that night, with her heels off, and her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. Alexander had been warm, attentive, exactly as he always was in public opening doors, remembering that she preferred still water to sparkling, asking about a Hope Bridge grant application she had mentioned 2 weeks earlier. He had suggested casually and with great apparent thoughtfulness that after the honeymoon he would love to sit in on a few Hayes Medical Board meetings. Just to understand the organization better, he said, just to be useful. Then midway through the main course he had set down his fork and looked at her with an expression she described as very still. "Has your father seemed different to you lately?" he said. "He looked at me last Sunday in a way I couldn't quite read." Emily's heart, she told me, had slammed against her sternum so hard she was certain he could see it through the fabric of her dress. She reached for her water glass, buying herself exactly 2 seconds, and then she looked at Alexander Reed with the open, slightly puzzled expression of a woman who had absolutely nothing to hide. "Dad's been stressed about the California expansion," she said. "You know how he gets when a project runs behind schedule. He's not sleeping well." She reached across the table and touched Alexander's hand. "Has he said something to you? I can talk to him if you want." Alexander watched her for 3 full seconds. She counted them. Then he turned his hand over and squeezed hers and said, "No, it's nothing. I just want to make sure he's comfortable with everything." "He loves you," Emily said, and her voice did not shake even slightly. When Alexander excused himself to use the restroom, his phone lit up on the table beside his napkin. Emily did not hesitate. She lifted it, read the message from a contact, saved only as J Pacific Rim, final contract executed. Ready to move on board access after ceremony, photographed the screen, and set the phone back down before he returned. She told me all of this in a flat, precise voice, and when she finished, she pressed her fingers over her eyes, and her shoulders shook once sharply like something being held together that very much wanted to come apart. "8 more days," I said. She dropped her hands. Her eyes were dry. "8 more days," she said. "Ray called me at 7 in the morning on May 27th from a coffee shop 2 blocks from the Pacific Rim medical supplies offices in San Francisco's Soma district. I could hear the ambient noise of the city behind his voice, traffic and espresso machine, the particular compressed energy of a place that starts early. "I need you to hear something," he said without greeting, "and I need you to hear it before I file it in the report because once it's in the report, it becomes something we have to act on immediately." I set down my coffee. "Go ahead." "My FDA contact confirmed 44 falsified clearance applications," he said. "We knew that. What I didn't have until last night is the distribution record where the equipment actually went after it was sold." A pause. 2 regional medical centers in New Jersey purchased Pacific Rim ventilator pressure components 6 months ago. Standard procurement, nothing flagged at the time because the paperwork looked clean. And I said, though the weight in his voice had already told me the answer was not going to be manageable. 6 weeks ago, a 63-year-old man named Gerald Foss was admitted to the ICU of one of those facilities following cardiac surgery. He did not survive the night. The attending physician noted a pressure irregularity in the ventilator readings in the final hour. The incident was logged as equipment malfunction and referred for review. Ray's voice stayed completely level, the way it does when a professional is working very hard to keep his own reaction from contaminating the information. "The review has not yet been completed. No one has connected it to Pacific Rim until now." I walked to my office window and pressed my hand flat against the glass. Gerald Foss, 63 years old. Cardiac surgery, which meant he had gone into that operating room, believing that the machines keeping him alive on the other side had been tested and approved and certified safe. He had trusted a system that had been quietly corrupted by 2 people who had never met him and did not care that he existed. My throat closed completely. I stood at that window and I breathed and I did not speak for a long moment because I did not trust what would come out. "Richard," Ray said quietly. "I heard you," I said. My voice came out rougher than I intended. "What does this mean legally?" "It escalates everything," Ray said. "Equipment fraud that results in patient harm moves this from financial crime into criminal negligence territory, potentially involuntary manslaughter depending on what the completed review determines. It also gives the FDA grounds for immediate emergency action against Pacific Rim, which my contact is already preparing." I thought about the 23 hospitals in my system, 12,000 staff, 2 million patients a year, trusting that the equipment surrounding them had been verified by people who took that responsibility seriously. I thought about what would have happened if Alexander Reed had walked down that aisle 8 days from now and taken his position at the edge of my organization and begun slowly and systematically introducing Pacific Rim's inventory into our procurement pipeline. How many Gerald Fosses would there have been? "Ray," I said, "make sure your FDA contact moves today, not next week, today." "Already in motion," he said. "There's one more thing. I sent the full Pacific Rim documentation to Agent Weiss this morning. She said it changes the federal charging landscape significantly. This is no longer only wire fraud and RICO. We are now looking at conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud, which under 18 United States Code, Section 1347, carries a maximum of 10 years per count." I turned away from the window. Across my desk in the silver frame beside my computer, Emily looked back at me from her Hope Bridge Gala photograph, head thrown back, laughing completely unguarded. 8 days. "Keep going," I said. "Whatever you need resources access time, you have it." "I know," Ray said. And then in a tone I had not heard from him before, something that was not quite professional and not quite personal, but lived in the space between them. "Richard, Gerald Foss is the reason we do this right. Not fast, right?" I looked at my daughter's photograph for another moment. "Agreed," I said. "Do it right." Wedding rehearsals are designed to make everything feel settled. The right people in the right places, the right words said in the right order, the machinery of a ceremony tested, so that on the day itself, nothing requires thinking. Standing in the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel on the evening of May 29th, 3 days before my daughter's wedding, I watched Alexander Reed work the room and understood with a clarity I had not had before exactly what I had been looking at for 8 months. Every handshake was placed, every smile landed at precisely the right moment. When he spotted Congressman David Palmer, a California representative who sat on the Senate Health Committee and had accepted his invitation as a gesture of professional courtesy, Alexander crossed the room with the practiced ease of a man who had spent years learning how to make powerful people feel personally regarded. He shook the congressman's hand with both of his, laughed at something Palmer said, touched his arm briefly in the way that signals genuine warmth to the person receiving it. It was a performance. I could see that now. Every gesture calibrated, every expression deployed. The audience had no idea they were watching a man run through a role he had rehearsed 1,000 times. He came to me next. He put his hand on my shoulder and squeezed it, and his eyes were warm and certain and completely unreadable beneath the warmth. 3 more days, he said. "You doing all right, Richard?" "Better than I've been in a long time," I said. And I meant it, though, not in the way he understood. He moved on. I watched him stop beside a woman near the end of the second row, well-dressed, composed, carrying a leather portfolio that might belong to any wedding guest. He extended his hand and said something pleasant, and she shook it and smiled. He had no idea that her name was Patricia Collins, that she was my attorney, or that the portfolio under her arm contained the document that would end him. I had to look away. Emily stood at the far end of the ballroom at the head of the rehearsal configuration, talking with Pastor William Brooks, a man who had officiated weddings in this room for 30 years, and whose bearing suggested he had seen enough of human nature to be unsurprised by most of it. He was tall, white-haired, with the particular stillness of someone who has learned to be fully present in rooms where people are at their most exposed. Emily was gesturing gently as she spoke to him, and he was nodding, and to anyone watching, they looked like a bride and her officiant going over the order of service. I waited until Alexander had drifted to the other side of the room. Then I excused myself from the small group I had been standing with and made my way to Pastor Brooks. He turned when I approached, and something in my expression must have reached him before I said anything, because his eyes sharpened slightly, not with alarm, but with attention. "Richard," he said. "Walk with me a moment." We moved to the side of the room, near the tall windows that looked out over Central Park South. The sounds of the rehearsal continued behind us. "Pastor," I said quietly, "I need to ask something of you that I can't fully explain tonight. On Sunday, when you reach the moment in the service where you ask if anyone has cause to object, I may need you to give me a moment to speak." I held his gaze. "I need to know that you'll be watching for me." He studied me for a long time, not the uncertain study of someone trying to decide whether to trust, but the measured study of someone who already has and is simply confirming the weight of what is being asked. "Is Emily all right?" he said. "She will be," I said. "After Sunday." He nodded slowly. "I'll be watching for you, Richard." I thanked him and moved back toward the group. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a message from Ray, time stamped 4 minutes earlier. Reed made private contact with 2 Hayes Medical Board members this week. Dinner invitations both accepted. Framed as getting to know the family before the wedding. Neither has responded yet. Recommend you reach out tonight. I read the message twice. Then I stepped into the corridor outside the ballroom, pulled up the numbers for both board members, and made 2 calls that took 11 minutes combined. Both men listened. Both agreed without requiring much explanation to decline Alexander's invitations and to say nothing to him about our conversation. When I came back into the ballroom, Alexander was standing near the front of the rehearsal configuration, one hand in his pocket, watching the room with the ease of a man who believed everything was proceeding exactly as planned. He was right about that. It was just not his plan that was proceeding. I have woken up at 5 in the morning my entire adult life. 40 years of early rounds, early flights, phone calls before sunrise that never meant good news. 40 years of being the person in the room who was already awake when difficult things needed to be done. Because difficult things tend to happen at hours when most people would prefer to be sleeping, and the ones who show up anyway are the ones who matter. I had built a career on that discipline. I had built a hospital system on it. I had sat at bedsides at 3 in the morning and made decisions that other people's lives depended on, and I had done it without flinching, because flinching was a luxury I had not allowed myself since my residency. The morning of my daughter's wedding was the first time in 40 years that I woke at 5 and simply sat still. I did not reach for my phone. I did not open the briefing documents I had brought out of habit and would not need today. I did not call Patricia or Ray or anyone else. I simply sat in the chair by the window of the suite on the 14th floor of the Plaza Hotel, and I looked out at Central Park and I let myself feel the full weight of what the next 6 hours contained. The park was gray-green and quiet in the early light of a June morning. The trees were heavy with late spring growth, their canopies so dense they looked solid from above a continuous dark green, interrupted only by the paths below, which were empty except for a single jogger moving along the perimeter road, with the steady, unhurried pace of someone who runs the same route every day and has stopped noticing the city around it. I watched that jogger until they disappeared around a curve and the path was empty again. And I thought about what it would feel like to be that person, to have this be an ordinary Tuesday morning, to have nothing more complicated ahead of you than a shower and a cup of coffee and the day's first meeting. I thought about Margaret, not in the abstract way I sometimes think about her, the generalized ache of absence that has become so familiar over 8 years that I no longer fully register it as pain. I thought about her specifically, precisely the way she looked on the morning we brought Emily home from the hospital, sitting in the back seat of the car with our daughter in her arms, an expression on her face of such complete, uncomplicated joy that I had to keep looking back at them in the rearview mirror just to confirm it was real. I thought about the morning Emily was born. I had been in surgery, a cardiac bypass that had run 4 hours over schedule on a patient who had arrived in crisis at 11 the previous night. And I received the news by way of a nurse who appeared in the doorway of the operating room and held up a handwritten sign that read, "Girl." Both fine, she was grinning behind her surgical mask. I had finished the procedure with tears running into my own mask that no one in that room mentioned afterward, which was a kindness I have never forgotten. Margaret had been awake when I finally reached the room 3 hours after our daughter arrived. She looked exhausted in the way that people look when they have done something that has taken everything they had, and luminous in the way that only happens when what they did was worth every bit of it. She looked at me and said very simply, "She has your hands, Richard, but she has my heart. Take care of it." I had kept that promise imperfectly, the way all promises made in hospital rooms get kept, with gaps and years when work pulled harder than it should have, with dinners missed and recitals arrived at late, and the particular failure of the person who is trying to do too many important things at once and succeeds at all of them by halves. I had not been the father I intended to be in every moment, but I had been present in the moments that required presence, and I was present now in a hotel suite in Midtown Manhattan on the morning of a wedding that was going to go very differently than the groom had planned. I sat with that thought for a while. Outside, the jogger had come back around the far end of the loop and was visible again, smaller now, with the distance moving with the same steady pace. The city below was beginning its first movements, a delivery truck on Central Park South. A doorman in a dark uniform stepping out onto the pavement of a building across the street. A taxi moving uptown with its light on. The ordinary machinery of a Tuesday morning in New York proceeding with complete indifference to what was about to happen 6 blocks away in a hotel ballroom. At 5:47, my phone buzzed on the side table. An email, no sender name, just a string of numbers where the address should have been. The kind of anonymized address that takes a specific and deliberate effort to construct, the kind used by someone who needs to say something they are not yet ready to attach their name to. I opened it. Don't let the wedding happen. He did the same thing to my mother in Denver 2 years ago. She never recovered. Please. TR. I read it once, then again, then a third time, more slowly, parsing each word, the way I parse a test result that does not match the clinical picture, looking for the thing I might have missed, the detail that changes the interpretation. I did not find one. The message was exactly what it appeared to be. My hands were completely steady as I forwarded it to Patricia and Ray with a single line: new victim. Denver. 2 years ago. TR. Find out what you can before 11. Patricia responded in 4 minutes. I knew she would be awake. She had been awake before 5 every morning for the past 2 weeks, because that is what Patricia Collins does when something matters. Her message was brief. On it. Don't change anything today. I set the phone down on the side table and sat with what I now knew. There was a woman in Denver. There was a daughter, TR, who had watched something happen to her mother and was still carrying it 2 years later at 5:47 in the morning, on the day a stranger's wedding was supposed to take place. She had sat somewhere in some room in some city and typed those 31 words and sent them into the dark without knowing whether they would reach anyone in time, because she could not stay silent and could not yet find her full name. I thought about Caroline Walsh in Chicago, Sandra Morrison in Dallas, a woman in Denver I did not have a name for, and somewhere in Santa Monica, in an apartment that no one in Alexander Reed's constructed life knew about, a 4-year-old boy named Oliver who had done absolutely nothing at all except exist. I thought about how many names we still did not have, how many cities, how many women who had told themselves afterward that it was a lesson learned and tried to walk forward into their own lives and found that some lessons leave marks that do not simply fade with time and distance. A knock at the door pulled me back into the room. Emily stood in the hallway in her robe, her hair loose around her shoulders, her face bare of makeup. She looked younger this way, closer to the girl I had driven to her first day of college, with her mother's old copy of Middlemarch on the seat between them, and an argument about directions that neither of us could remember the specifics of now. Her eyes were clear, carrying the particular steadiness of someone who has made peace with something very difficult and is not yet sure how long that peace will hold. I couldn't sleep either, she said. Come in, I said. She came in and sat on the edge of the bed closest to the window, and I sat back down in the chair, and we stayed like that together in the early morning light without speaking for a long time. Outside, the park was getting brighter by degrees. The jogger had gone. The delivery truck had moved on. Below us, the city was finding its pace. My mom would have known something was wrong with him from day one, Emily said. Her voice was quiet and certain, not accusatory, just the plain statement of a daughter who understood her mother clearly enough to know exactly how that particular conversation would have gone. Wouldn't she? It was not quite a question. I answered it anyway. 5 minutes, I said. Maybe less. Emily smiled at that. A real smile, small and a little sad, the kind that carries more weight than the large, uncomplicated ones, because it holds grief and warmth at the same time and makes no attempt to separate them. She looked out at the park, and the smile faded into something quieter and more settled. I keep thinking about Caroline Walsh, she said, and Sandra Morrison, and whoever TR is. She turned to look at me directly. "They didn't have anyone, Dad. Nobody stood up." "Someone is standing up," I said. She held my gaze for a long moment. Something moved through her face, not resolution exactly, more like the recognition of something she had already decided and was simply confirming. Then she nodded once and stood and smoothed the front of her robe with both hands. At the door, she stopped. On the floor outside the suite, a hotel staff member had placed a large arrangement of white roses in a crystal vase. The same white roses she had carried in the photographs we had looked at together 3 weeks ago, when she was still the woman planning a wedding, and I was still the father who did not know what I know now. A small card was tucked between the stems. Emily leaned down and took it. She read it. Then she held it out to me without a word. "Today, everything changes." I read it. I set it down on the side table beside my phone next to the email from TR that was still open on the screen. Emily looked at me over the doorframe. Her eyes were dry and completely steady, and in them I could see her mother, and I could see the 34-year-old woman she had become, and I could see the girl who had once stood in our kitchen at 8 years old and told me very seriously that she intended to save the world when she grew up, and had seemed genuinely surprised that I thought this was in any way implausible. "He's right about that," she said, and walked back to her room to get dressed. I stayed in the chair by the window for a few more minutes after she left. The park below was fully lit. Now the morning properly arrived, the paths filling with the people who come out when the day is fresh, and the city has not yet made its full demands. I watched them for a while. Then I stood up, straightened my suit trousers, and went to finish getting dressed. There was work to do, and today we were going to do it. 200 people were in that room. They came expecting a wedding. What they got was something none of them will ever forget, and neither will I. Before I take you inside that ballroom type ready below, let me see who's still standing with me. Quick note, parts of this story include fictional elements added to educate and entertain. If that's not something you want to hear, you can step away right here, and I completely understand. The Plaza Hotel has hosted weddings for over 100 years. I have attended perhaps a dozen of them in that ballroom over the course of my career. The marriages of colleagues, of board members, of people whose lives had intersected with mine, long enough to warrant an invitation and a gift. I had always found the grand ballroom beautiful in the way that rooms built for ceremony are beautiful deliberately expensively, with the specific intention of making the people inside feel that what they are doing matters. Walking in as the father of the bride, I felt none of that. What I felt moving through the doors and down the side aisle toward my seat in the front row was the particular focused calm of a man who has prepared for something for a very long time and is now within minutes of the moment when all that preparation either holds or it doesn't. The room was full. 200 people in white-covered chairs arranged in precise rows on either side of a center aisle, scattered with white rose petals. Crystal chandeliers caught the morning light. The string quartet in the corner played something I recognized but could not name. Near the front, Congressman David Palmer sat in the third chair of the first row, talking quietly with the man beside him, his posture relaxed in the way of someone who expects this to be a pleasant morning. He did not know yet what kind of morning it was going to be. I found Patricia near the back of the room, seated on the aisle in the last row, a cream-colored envelope in her lap that looked exactly like a wedding program. She caught my eye for exactly 1 second and gave the smallest possible nod. In the row behind her, 2 men in dark suits sat with the particular stillness of people who are working. FBI. I looked away and took my seat. Alexander appeared from the side door near the altar at 10 minutes before 11. He was wearing a charcoal Brioni suit that had been fitted with obvious care, a white pocket square, a tie the exact shade of Emily's bridesmaid flowers. He moved to his position at the front, with the ease of a man who had never once in his life felt uncertain in a room, shaking hands with Pastor Brooks, adjusting his cufflinks, turning to look back down the aisle, with an expression of uncomplicated happiness on his face. That expression was what I found most remarkable. Not the suit, not the ease, not the performance of warmth as he acknowledged guests who caught his eye. The happiness. It looked genuine. It had always looked genuine. I had spent 40 years learning to read people, and I had not seen through it for 8 months. I wanted to be angry at myself for that. I had decided sometime in the past 2 weeks that anger at myself was a luxury I could not afford and would not indulge. What mattered now was the next 20 minutes. He came to me. He sat beside me briefly in the front row, something he had clearly planned as a gesture of warmth toward the father of the bride, and he put his hand on my arm and leaned close. "Thank you, Richard," he said, "for everything, for trusting me with her." My chest tightened with something I did not allow to become anything. "Take care of her," I said, because it was true in the way that many things are true until they are not. He squeezed my arm and moved back to his position. I watched him walk away, and I thought about Gerald Foss, 63 years old, who had gone into cardiac surgery trusting that the machines around him were safe. I thought about Caroline Walsh, who had signed what was put in front of her and walked away telling herself it was a lesson. I thought about a woman in Denver, whose name I still did not know, and a daughter who had sent an email in the middle of the night because she could not stay silent and could not yet find her full voice. I thought about Margaret, who had looked at me from a hospital bed 34 years ago and asked me to take care of a heart that was not mine to keep, only to protect. The doors at the back of the ballroom opened. Emily stood in the frame of the doorway in a dress that her mother would have chosen, simple, precisely fitted nothing that asked for attention it didn't earn. She was holding a small bouquet of white roses, the same flowers Alexander had sent to her room that morning. She was looking straight ahead. Her face was composed and clear and entirely her own. She took my arm when I reached her. Her hand was steady. We walked down the aisle together, and I felt each step the way you feel things, when you know they are the last time. The last time I would walk my daughter toward a future without knowing what it held. The last time I would be the only person in this room who knew what was about to happen. Pastor Brooks began. The early portions of the ceremony moved forward with the smooth inevitability of something rehearsed. Alexander spoke his early responses with warmth and conviction. 200 people watched with the open, trusting attention of an audience that has been given no reason to look for anything beneath the surface. Pastor Brooks reached the moment. "If anyone present has cause to object to this union," he said in the formal cadence of a man who had said those words 200 times, "let them speak now." The room held its breath the way rooms always do at that moment, out of habit, out of ceremony, without any real expectation of an answer. I stood up. 200 people turned to look at me. Alexander smiled. It was the same smile he had used at Le Bernardin on our first dinner at Thanksgiving on the terrace of my apartment. Warm, easy, the smile of a man who is completely comfortable with whatever is happening. He assumed I was going to give a toast. I could see it in the slight relaxation of his shoulders, the way he tilted his head with patient indulgence. I walked to the front of the room. My voice when I spoke came out the way I needed it to, steady, clear, carrying to the back rows without effort. I had delivered difficult words in difficult rooms for 40 years. I knew how to make a room listen. Before my daughter says I do, I said, "There are things this room needs to hear. 40 years of running hospitals taught me one thing that I believe with my whole chest. Silence in the face of harm is not kindness. It is complicity." The room shifted. Not loudly, there was no gasp, no murmur. Just the particular quality of attention that comes when 200 people simultaneously understand that something unexpected is happening and that it is serious. I nodded toward the back of the room. The screen behind the altar, a 12-foot display that had been set up for a wedding slideshow that would now never play, lit up white. Ray positioned in a service corridor with a laptop, and the audio file I had sent him 3 days earlier pressed play. Alexander's voice filled the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel. "Once the wedding goes through, the whole Hayes infrastructure opens up. 23 hospitals. That's the number, Jessica. 23. I watched Alexander's face. The smile stayed for approximately 4 seconds after his own voice began playing. That was how long it took for his brain to process what was happening. Then the smile disappeared, replaced by something I had never seen from him before. Not anger, not fear, but a rapid, cold recalibration. The expression of a man running through options at speed. He stepped toward me. His voice was low and controlled, pitched for me, rather than the room. "Richard, this is being taken completely out of context." But the recording kept playing. Jessica Miller's voice followed, precise and unhurried. "And Emily, does she know anything?" And then Alexander's own voice again, delivering the sentence that had stopped my heart in a restaurant in West Hollywood 2 weeks earlier. "Emily sees exactly what I want her to see." The room was absolutely still. Congressman David Palmer had stopped moving entirely. His body angled toward the speaker with the focused attention of a man whose professional instincts had just activated. Several guests in the middle rows had their hands pressed to their mouths. Others sat with the rigid stillness of people absorbing something that is reorganizing their understanding in real time. Alexander turned to face the room. He straightened his jacket. When he spoke, his voice had shifted into something I had not heard before, harder, more precise, stripped of the warmth that had never been real. "What you just heard," he said loudly enough for the room, "is an illegally obtained recording. In the state of California, recording a private conversation without the consent of all parties is a criminal offense. Richard has exposed himself to significant legal liability, and I can assure you that my attorney—" Patricia Collins stood up from the last row. She moved down the aisle with the unhurried certainty of someone who has done difficult things in front of a large audiences many times and found it unremarkable. She was carrying the Navy folder. She stopped at the front of the room and turned to face the guests, and her voice when she spoke was completely level. "Your attorney, Mr. Reed," she said, "is a man named Marcus Webb. Mr. Webb was disbarred by the Illinois State Bar in 2021 for conduct involving financial misrepresentation under the name Andrew Reeves." She paused for exactly one beat. "The same name on your birth certificate." The air went out of the room. Alexander's mouth opened. For the first time since I had known him, nothing came out of it. The machinery behind his eyes was running at full speed, and producing nothing usable because there was nothing usable to produce. He had prepared for many contingencies. He had not prepared for this one because he had not believed it was possible. He had not believed that anyone had gotten there ahead of him. Emily stepped forward from where she had been standing beside Pastor Brooks. She looked at Alexander with an expression I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Not rage, not satisfaction, something quieter and more final than either of those. The look of a woman who has fully seen something and will not unsee it. "Alex," she said. Her voice was soft and completely steady. "I've known everything for 2 weeks." His eyes moved to her face. Something happened in them that I could not fully read the one moment in the entire morning when I thought I saw something real move through him. Whether it was genuine or one final performance, I cannot tell you. I do not think it matters. Patricia opened the Navy folder. "My name is Patricia Collins," she said to the room. "I am Mr. Hayes' attorney, and what you just heard is only the beginning of what this room needs to know." Patricia Collins has never been a dramatic person. In 25 years of practicing law, she has won cases not by performing for juries, but by placing facts in front of people so clearly, so unavoidably that the conclusion becomes the only reasonable destination. She does not raise her voice. She does not pause for effect. She simply builds piece by piece until the structure is so solid that dismantling it would require dismantling reality itself. That morning in the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, in front of 200 people who had come expecting a wedding, she did exactly that. She set the Navy folder on the table at the front of the room with the deliberate care of someone who has handled important documents for long enough to understand that how you place something matters as much as what it contains. Then she straightened, turned to face the room, and looked at the 200 people looking back at her with the unhurried steadiness of a woman who has stood in difficult rooms many times and found them unremarkable. She opened the folder. "Andrew Reeves," she said. "Born Springfield, Illinois, 1986. She nodded toward the screen behind the altar, and the image Ray had cued from the service corridor appeared an Illinois driver's license. The photograph, unmistakably the man standing 12 feet away from her in a charcoal Brioni suit, looking as though the floor beneath him had just shifted without warning. The name Alexander Reed was constructed approximately 5 years ago, with supporting documentation designed to pass standard background verification. It is not his legal name. It has never been his legal name. A sound moved through the room, not a gasp, something quieter and more unsettled than that. The sound of understanding arriving in a place that had not prepared for it. I watched it move from the back rows forward, like a ripple across still water, as people absorbed what the image on the screen meant and began one by one to recalibrate everything they thought they knew about the man standing at the front of the room. Patricia continued without pausing. "Caroline Walsh, 61 years old, Chicago, Illinois." A document appeared on the screen property transfer records column after column of legal language that resolved at the bottom into a single transaction. 18 months ago, Ms. Walsh transferred 40% of the voting shares in her family's hotel company, a business her late husband built over 30 years, into a joint trust naming Andrew Reeves as co-trustee with equal authority over all decisions. 8 weeks after that transfer cleared, Reeves terminated the engagement and disappeared. Ms. Walsh filed no police report. She pursued no civil litigation. She told herself it was a lesson learned. Patricia's voice did not change in register or pace. She is 61 years old. She built nothing wrong. She simply trusted someone who had spent months earning that trust with deliberate precision. She let that land for exactly 2 seconds. Sandra Morrison, 55 years old, Dallas, Texas. Another document, another column of numbers that meant someone's life savings, someone's inheritance, someone's future, reduced to a line item on a transfer record. $2.3 million moved from accounts in her name into joint structures naming Andrew Reeves as a controlling party before the relationship ended. Same methodology, same outcome, no complaint filed. Patricia looked up from the document. Ms. Morrison told someone close to her afterward that she felt like the guilty party. She spent 2 years believing that. I was watching Alexander. His face had gone through several versions of itself in the past 4 minutes. The rapid recalibration I had seen when the recording began, then the controlled aggression of the California recording gambit, then the stillness that followed Patricia's disbarment revelation. Now something else had settled over him entirely. His jaw was set and his eyes were moving around the room with the particular calculation of a man counting exits and finding none. His hands, I noticed, had stopped moving. He had been adjusting his cufflinks when Patricia began. He was not adjusting them anymore. There were no exits. The 2 FBI agents who had been sitting in the 8th and 9th seats of the back row since before the doors opened, dressed in dark suits indistinguishable from any other wedding guest, had positioned themselves with quiet efficiency near the main doors and the side entrance. They had not drawn attention to themselves. They did not need to. Their presence was not for the room. It was for Alexander, who understood exactly what it meant, and for Jessica Miller, who was about to understand. Pacific Rim Medical Supplies, Patricia said, a company in which Mr. Reed holds a controlling interest through a series of shell entities corporations, with no real operations, no employees, no legitimate business activity registered in the Cayman Islands and Luxembourg, specifically to obscure the chain of ownership. In the past 2 years, Pacific Rim submitted 47 applications for FDA medical device clearance, the federal certification required before any medical equipment can legally be sold to hospitals in the United States. She paused to look at the room, not for effect, but to ensure the significance of the next sentence had space to land properly. 44 of those 47 applications contained falsified laboratory test data, fabricated manufacturer documentation, and in several cases, certifications from facilities that do not exist. The equipment has been sold to medical centers in New Jersey. Federal investigators are currently examining a patient death 6 weeks ago that may be connected to a pressure valve failure in Pacific Rim ventilator components. The room had gone so quiet I could hear the chandelier crystals move slightly in the ventilation current from the air conditioning above us. 200 people were not breathing at their normal rate. I could feel it, the particular stillness of a large group of people, absorbing something that was reorganizing their understanding of what kind of morning this is. Congressman David Palmer was no longer sitting. He was standing very still with the expression of a man who has just understood that a problem he did not know existed has landed squarely in his jurisdiction, and that the correct response is not alarm, but action. I had a feeling that before noon today, he would be on the phone with people who needed to know what he now knew. Patricia reached into the folder one final time. She removed a single document, 1 page dense, with legal language in the small, precise typeface of a document prepared by a professional who expected it to be executed, not read carefully. She held it up for a moment before nodding toward the screen, where Ray enlarged it to a size the entire room could see. This document, Sichi, she said, was recovered from electronic communications obtained under a federal search warrant executed 3 days ago. Her voice was completely level. It is a divorce filing, not a template, not a draft. A completed divorce filing prepared in its entirety, signed by the attorney who drafted it, dated 3 months before today's wedding ceremony. She waited while the room read the header of the document on the screen. I watched people's faces as they did. I watched the moment arrive person by person when the date registered. The asset division terms, Patricia continued, were drafted to transfer substantially all marital property to Mr. Reed in the event of dissolution of the marriage, including real property investment accounts, business interests, and any assets acquired jointly or transferred during the marriage. She set the page down on the table beside her, with the same deliberate care with which she had placed the folder. Mr. Reed did not plan to take assets before the marriage. He planned the divorce before the wedding. The silence that followed lasted 10 full seconds. I counted them. In that silence, I thought about a second-hand examination table in a storefront on Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, and a promise made to a city that did not know yet that someone was making it. I thought about Margaret in a hospital bed with our daughter in her arms, and a look in her eyes that I have spent 34 years trying to be worthy of. I thought about Caroline Walsh in Chicago, and Sandra Morrison in Dallas, and a woman in Denver whose name I still did not have, and a 4-year-old boy in Santa Monica who had done nothing at all except exist in the wrong household. 10 seconds of silence in a room full of people is a very long time. Then Jessica Miller, seated in the third row, in a charcoal blazer with her leather portfolio on her lap, stood up. She moved toward the side door with the controlled urgency of a woman who has identified the only available exit and intends to reach it before anyone understands what she is doing. She did not reach it. The two FBI agents moved at the same moment, converging from opposite sides with the practiced efficiency of people who had been waiting for exactly this and had agreed in advance on exactly how it would go. One of them said something quiet and professional, not loud enough for the room to hear the words, only the tone. Jessica Miller stopped walking. She stood very still in the middle of the side aisle, her portfolio clutched against her chest. With both arms, her face doing the same rapid recalibration I had watched Alexander's do 6 minutes earlier. The difference was that Alexander had options he was still calculating. Jessica's expression said she understood in that moment that she did not. Congressman David Palmer found his voice. He had been standing since Patricia said the word ventilator, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the silent room the way voices do when the person speaking has spent a career learning how to be heard in large spaces by people who need to pay attention. "I sit on the Senate Health Committee," he said. He was looking directly at Alexander Reed and Andrew Reeves with the focused, dispassionate attention of a man who has shifted from being a wedding guest to being a public official in the span of 11 minutes. Pacific Rim Medical Supplies is now a federal matter. He paused for exactly one beat. "And so are you, Mr. Reed." Emily, standing beside me, reached out and took my hand. She did not squeeze it. She simply held it the way you hold something you are grateful is still there. I held on. I have read about moments in history when a room changed because something true was said out loud that could never be unsaid. I always imagine those moments as loud, dramatic, operatic, the kind of rupture you feel in your chest from across a distance. I was wrong about that. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel emptied in almost complete silence. It began with the back rows. People stood gathered their programs and their handbags and moved toward the doors with the quiet deliberateness of people who had just witnessed something they needed to process somewhere other than where it had happened. There was no commotion, no raised voices, just the steady soft sound of 200 people deciding one by one, and then in groups that there was nothing left to stay for. The colleagues who had worked alongside me for decades passed the front row on their way out. Several of them met my eyes. A hand on the shoulder from one man I had known for 20 years. A small nod from another. No words. Words would have been insufficient, and they understood that. Alexander stood at the front of the room and watched it happen. He had made one more attempt in the seconds after Congressman Palmer sat back down to address the room. He had started a sentence something about context, about misrepresentation, about giving him the opportunity to respond to what had been presented. His voice had carried the last remnants of the ease and authority he had spent 5 years constructing. Nobody turned around. He finished his sentence to the backs of people who had already decided. The sentence died in the middle of the room, and after that he stopped talking because Alexander Reed was above everything else a man who understood when something was over. I watched his shoulders drop by perhaps 1/4 of an inch. It was the smallest movement. It was the most honest thing I had ever seen him do. Emily was standing beside me. She had moved to my side sometime in the past several minutes without my noticing, and she was watching Alexander with an expression I recognized from her mother, the particular stillness of a woman who has finished grieving something while it was still happening because she had started earlier than anyone knew. Alexander turned to face her. The room was more than half empty now, the sound of footsteps and quiet conversation drifting back from the lobby. "Emily," he said. His voice was stripped of everything that had made it warm. What remained was something flat and functional. If you would just give me the chance to explain the full picture, I already have the full picture, Alex. Her voice was soft and final, the way a door sounds when it closes on a room you are not going back into. I've had it for 2 weeks. Every document, every name, every account. She looked at him steadily, her hands loose at her sides, her bouquet of white roses still in her left hand. I know about Caroline, I know about Sandra, I know about Jessica and Pacific Rim, and the divorce filing you had ready before we were married. A breath. I know about the little boy in Santa Monica. Something moved across Alexander's face at that last sentence. A flicker I could not fully read there, and gone before I could name it. Whether it was genuine feeling, or the final performance of a man who had been performing for so long, he no longer knew the difference. I could not say. I did not think it mattered. He had nothing left to say. For the first time in 8 months, Alexander Reed had nothing left to say. The room was nearly empty now. Pastor Brooks stood quietly at his position near the altar, his hands folded, his eyes calm. He had not moved from his place through any of it. There was something in his stillness that felt less like inaction and more like witness the conscious choice of a man who understood that some moments require someone to simply remain present while they complete themselves. When nearly the last guest had filed out, a woman I had not noticed before slowed as she passed the front of the room. She was dressed simply, a cream blouse, dark trousers, low heels, in a way that had allowed her to sit unremarkably among 200 people for the past hour without drawing any particular attention. She was somewhere in her early 60s with careful eyes and the composed bearing of someone who has spent a long time learning how to hold difficult things without showing the weight of them. She stopped beside Emily. She did not say anything. She simply took Emily's free hand in both of hers and held it for a moment, a brief, complete gesture, the kind that carries more meaning than sentences. Emily looked at her, and I watched my daughter's composure shift almost imperceptibly, the way it does when unexpected kindness arrives at exactly the moment you are most exposed. The woman released Emily's hand, nodded once, and continued toward the door. Emily turned to me with a question in her eyes. Patricia stepped forward from where she had been standing nearby. Her voice was very quiet. "That was Caroline Walsh," she said. "She flew in from Chicago this morning. I sent her an invitation 3 days ago. I thought she deserved to be in this room when it happened." Emily looked toward the door through which Caroline Walsh had just passed. She pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose, and her eyes filled, but did not overflow the particular restraint of someone who is saving something fair later for somewhere private for a moment, when she does not need to be strong for any reason other than her own. Pastor Brooks spoke then from the front of the room. His voice was unhurried and quiet, addressed to no one in particular, and to everyone who remained. "I have officiated over 200 weddings in this room," he said. "I have never been more certain that I was exactly where I needed to be." I put my hand on Emily's shoulder. She leaned into it just slightly the way she used to when she was small enough to carry, and I stood beside my daughter in the emptied ballroom of the Plaza Hotel in the wreckage of a wedding that had never been real, and I felt something that I had not expected to feel in that moment. I felt grateful. People sometimes ask me if I felt triumphant after that morning. I want to be honest with you because honesty is the only thing this story has ever had any use for. What I felt mostly was tired. The deep, settled kind of tired that comes not from exertion, but from carrying something very heavy for a long time, and finally being permitted to set it down. The days that followed moved at a different pace than the 2 weeks that had preceded them. Not slower exactly, more, like clearer. As though a frequency that had been running underneath everything finally went quiet. 3 days after the wedding, that never happened. FBI Special Agent Sandra Weiss called Patricia to confirm what Ray had already heard. Through his contacts, Alexander Reed, Andrew Reeves had been apprehended at John F. Kennedy International Airport at 6:47 in the morning, attempting to board a flight to Zurich on a passport issued to a third identity that none of us had known existed. He had a carry-on bag. Inside it, among other things, was a prepaid phone, 3 sets of identification documents, and $60,000 in mixed currencies. He had been planning to run. He simply had not planned well enough for how quickly the net would close. The indictment came down from the Southern District of New York 11 days later. 11 federal counts wire: fraud, identity fraud, aggravated identity theft, conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud, money laundering, RICO, conspiracy, false statements. To federal investigators, mail, fraud, passport, fraud. and one count under a statute I had never heard of before that covers the fraudulent procurement of financial instruments across state lines. His bail was set at $4 million, which he could not make, and he went to a federal detention facility in Manhattan to await trial. Jessica Miller was arrested at her Century City apartment in Los Angeles on the same morning Alexander was taken at JFK. She had apparently not planned to run, or had planned it and not executed in time. She faced 9 of the same counts plus 2 additional charges related to her prior SEC investigation that the new evidence had reopened. Her attorney entered a not guilty plea on her behalf 4 days later. That was the last public statement anyone connected to her made. The FDA issued an emergency cease and desist order against Pacific Rim Medical Supplies within 48 hours of the wedding. All inventory was recalled. Federal inspectors arrived at the San Francisco offices on a Tuesday morning and spent 3 days cataloging what they found. I was told by Ray, who had a contact inside the inspection team, that what they found was considerably worse than what we had been able to document independently. The investigation into Gerald Foss's death was formally reopened as a potential criminal negligence case. Dr. Margaret Carroll organized a comprehensive audit of every piece of equipment in our 23 facilities within the week. She sent me a report on a Friday afternoon that ran to 41 pages and concluded with a single sentence in the summary section: "No Pacific Rim equipment identified in any Hayes medical facility." Audit complete. I read that sentence 4 times. Each time it felt like something I had not known I was holding released slightly in my chest. Caroline Walsh called Patricia 2 days after the wedding. She did not say much. She asked what she needed to do, and Patricia told her, and she said she would do it. Sandra Morrison called the following morning. She had seen something on the news. The story had moved quickly once it connected to a federal indictment, and she said she had been waiting for 2 years for a reason to stop feeling like the guilty party in what had happened to her. "Tell me where to sign," she said. "And I will sign it." Congressman David Palmer opened a subcommittee inquiry into medical device certification fraud within 10 days of the wedding. He called me personally to let me know, which I appreciated, and to ask if I would be willing to testify. I told him I would testify to anything that helped make sure what had happened to Gerald Foss could not happen to anyone else. The deposition took place in Washington on a Thursday in late June. I sat in a wood-paneled room and answered questions for 3 hours, and at the end of it, a staff attorney shook my hand and said something I have thought about several times since. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "in 20 years of this work, I have never seen a private citizen build a more complete evidentiary record before coming to us. You did our job for us." I thanked her. I did not tell her that I had simply done what 40 years of running hospitals had taught me to do, that the difference between a problem and a catastrophe is almost always the quality of the documentation. Then came the detail that none of us had anticipated, the one that arrived not through Patricia or Ray or the FBI, but through a quiet call from a social worker at a California Family Services agency. Alexander and Jessica had a son, 4 years old. His name was Oliver, and he had been living in an apartment in Santa Monica in the care of a nanny who had been paid in cash and asked no questions. When both of his parents were taken into federal custody on the same morning, Oliver had been alone in that apartment for 6 hours before a neighbor noticed and called someone. Child Protective Services placed him with a temporary foster family, while authorities worked to locate extended relatives. The social worker who called me had found my name in the investigation documents and wanted to make sure I was aware, though she could not tell me more than that. I sat at my desk after that call for a long time. I thought about a 4-year-old boy named Oliver, who had done absolutely nothing wrong, and whose life had been organized entirely around people who treated other human beings as instruments. I hoped someone would find him a good place. I hoped he would not remember enough of this to carry it. That evening I found a plain white envelope on my desk that my assistant had left without comment, no return address. Inside a card, cream-colored small, written in a careful hand, "Thank you for stopping him. He had done this before, and no one stopped him. You did. CW." I set the card down on the desk beside the photograph of Emily. I looked at both of them for a while. Then I turned off the desk lamp and went home. 6 months after the wedding, that never happened. Emily and I stood on a sidewalk in Brooklyn on a Thursday morning in December, looking up at a building that I had not set foot inside in 37 years. It was 2 blocks from the storefront on Atlantic Avenue where I had opened my first clinic in 1984, the one with the second-hand examination table and the handwritten sign in the window, and the promise I had made to myself about not turning anyone away. The building itself was different now, renovated and repurposed, but the neighborhood had the same quality. It had always had a particular kind of working solidity. The feeling of a place where people got up early and did necessary things and expected the institutions around them to do the same. The sign above the door read, Hayes Foundation for Patient Safety. Emily had designed it herself. She had also written the mission statement, hired the initial staff of 7, established the independent oversight board, and constructed the financial transparency protocols that required every dollar received and every dollar spent to be publicly disclosed within 30 days. She had done all of this in 6 months, while simultaneously continuing to run Hope Bridge Foundation, and she had done it with the particular focused energy of someone who has found a way to transform something that was done to them into something they are doing for others. She looked up at the sign for a moment, then she looked at me. "It's good, right?" she said. "It's very good," I said. She smiled, the real one, the one that reaches her eyes, the one I had not seen for a long time and had been waiting for without letting myself acknowledge the waiting. Sophie Bennett had flown in from a work trip in Boston to be there for the opening. She stood beside Emily with a coffee in each hand and the expression of someone who has watched a friend walk through something very hard and come out the other side more themselves than before. "You look like your mother," Sophie said to Emily quietly enough that it was meant for her alone. Emily heard it and pressed her lips together and nodded and did not say anything, which was the right response, and Sophie knew it. Inside, the offices were small and purposeful, the organized energy of a place that has work to do and intends to do it. The Foundation's dual mandate was straightforward independent monitoring of medical device certification in partnership with the FDA's Oversight Division and direct support services for individuals who had experienced financial fraud in intimate relationships. 2 things that had come together in one story and would now, in some small measure, move forward separately and usefully in the world. Patricia had called me 3 weeks after the wedding with the answer to the question I had stopped expecting to resolve. "TR," she said. "Teresa Reeves, Andrew Reeves' younger sister. She's 34 years old, lives in Portland, Oregon. She knew what her brother was. She had known for years." I sat down. "She tried to warn the family of a woman in Denver 2 years ago," Patricia continued. "A woman named Helen Marsh, whose daughter had become engaged to someone using a different name in a different city. Teresa contacted the daughter directly. The daughter didn't believe her. Helen Marsh went through with the relationship and lost a significant portion of her savings before it ended. Teresa has been carrying that," I said. "For 2 years," Patricia said. "She told me I reached out to her last week that she had been watching her brother's public profile. When she saw the announcement of his engagement to Emily Hayes in a New York Society publication, she sat at her kitchen table at 11:30 at night and typed that email. She said she didn't know if it would reach anyone in time. She said she sent it because she couldn't not send it." I thought about a woman in Portland sitting alone at a kitchen table in the middle of the night, typing a message to a stranger, not knowing whether it would matter, sending it anyway, because the alternative was to stay silent again. "Is she all right?" I said. "She's getting there," Patricia said. "She asked me to tell you something if I spoke to you. She said..." Patricia paused and I heard the faint sound of paper. She said, "Tell him that my brother made choices I could not stop, but someone finally stopped the choices. That's enough for me." I held the phone for a moment after Patricia finished. Outside my office window, Manhattan was doing what it always does, moving indifferent, continuous, enormous. I was grateful for it. I was grateful for the scale of it, for the way a city that large makes the specific weight of any one story feel briefly usefully small. That afternoon, I drove to the cemetery in Connecticut, where Margaret was buried for the first time since the previous spring. The ground was cold and the trees were bare, and the light had the thin, clear quality of a December afternoon that knows it will be dark early. I set white roses against the stone, the kind she had always preferred, simple and unperforming. I stood there for a while. I told her about the foundation. I told her about Emily, how she had stood in that ballroom and said everything that needed to be said in a voice that did not shake, and then come home and built something. I told her that our daughter had her heart, which she had always known, but that our daughter also had a spine made of something I was still trying to find the right word for. I told her I had kept my promise. The drive back to the city took 2 hours in light December traffic. I spent most of it thinking about nothing particular, the kind of thinking that is really just the mind returning to its own level after a long time at an angle. By the time I crossed back into Manhattan, I felt something I recognized but had not felt in a while. I felt ordinary, quietly, gratefully ordinary. The morning after the foundation's opening, Emily came to my office before her first meeting of the day the way she had started doing in the past few months. She brought coffee black, no sugar, exactly right. And she sat in the chair across from my desk, and we talked about the work ahead, the regulatory partnerships to formalize the support programs, to design the people they would try to reach. At some point, she set down her cup and looked at me with an expression that was both casual and not. "Dad," she said, "I've been meaning to ask you something. In that restaurant in Los Angeles, when you heard what you heard, how did you know to record it? Instead of just walking away or confronting him or—" She paused. "How did you know that was the right thing to do in that moment?" I thought about it. The table at Nobu, the bamboo partition. Alexander's voice carrying through the warm Los Angeles evening, with the confidence of a man who believed he could not be overheard. The 37-year-old instinct that had simply taken over before the decision was conscious. "But 40 years of running hospitals," I said. "You learn that the most dangerous person in any room is never the one who looks dangerous. It's the one who has spent years making sure they don't." I looked at my daughter across the desk. "And you learn that when something doesn't add up, you don't walk away from it. You stay, you pay attention, you document what you find." Emily nodded slowly. She looked out the window at the December morning, at the city going about its business 12 stories below. Then she smiled, the real one, her mother's one, and picked up her coffee and said, "Okay, let's get to work." I watched her stand and straighten her jacket and move toward the door with the particular purposeful energy of a woman who has somewhere to be and something to do when she gets there. And I thought, "Margaret, I kept the promise. That is enough. That is everything. I have told you this family story because I believe it matters. The most dangerous person in your life will never look dangerous. They will look like everything you have been quietly hoping for. They will remember your coffee order, ask about your mother, and make you feel seen, completely perfectly seen. Do not let that be enough. Ask harder questions. Trust the small voice that says something does not add up. In 40 years, that voice has never once been wrong. I am not a perfect man. I missed things I should have seen, but I showed up when it counted. I kept a promise made in a hospital room to a woman I still visit at a cemetery in Connecticut when the light is right. I believe God places certain mornings in front of us, mornings when we walk into the right room at the right moment and hear exactly what we need to hear. Do not waste those mornings. This is a family betrayal story, but underneath the family betrayal, it is a family story about love's survival and the courage to stand up before it is too late. Do not wait as long as I did to ask the questions that matter. If this story reached you, leave a comment. Tell me what stayed with you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Thank you for staying until the very end. Some stories in this series contain fictional elements built to educate and inspire. If this content is not right for you, we understand. Choose what serves you best.